No? Cool, thank you. Call the meeting to order. Hang on, classes. The TNRD acknowledges that we connect with many First Nations communities across our vast regional district, and today are located on the Tecumseh territory, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of Secwepemc. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with our friends at Tecumseh and respect the territory and land on which we gather today. Any additions or deletions to the agenda?
So moved.
Moved by Director Stamer, seconded by Director Laird. All those in favor? Carried. Minutes, any issues with the minutes? Nope. Good. Someone move. Thank you. Moved by Director Grenier, seconded by Director Thorpe. All in favor? That's carried. We are now at 5.1, and I will turn this over to CFO Fox, I assume.
Thank you very much. So it's been a while since I've been before you. The first item on the agenda is the first quarter operating and capital actual variance to budget report. It's interesting to try and bring forward a budget variance for an organization so big with so many services and do it in a way that people are going to find meaningful. Right now with the budget variance, we have brought it by category. So you'll see variance in wages overall for the TNRD, variance in contract services. You could break it down. We've given you, here's what the dog control budget is. Here's what we've actually spent. Here's what the variance. What I've tried to do, I've taken a lot of feedback over the budget presentation to the board over the last year, and I'm getting kind of a variety of feedback. One consistently I'm hearing is, we know you have all the data. It's a lot of information to go through, and we need you to tone it back a little bit. So trying to find a balance in the information that I can present and make it meaningful to you. So this is the first time since I've been here that a budget variance has been brought to the committee. I don't know historically if budget variances were brought to the board. So I think from my perspective, rather than walk through a bunch of this, you guys have kind of seen it. I'm kind of open if you guys have feedback on what you're seeing, or if you'd like to see things a little bit differently, because of course you guys kind of get the first look at these numbers, and then it would go to the board as information for them as well, so they can see it. So right now, I just kind of want to stop and see if you guys have any input or feedback on what you're seeing. If you liked the document package that you saw in the detail that it was, if you'd like to see things a little bit different. Alls I would caution and get you to remember that with 125 services, certain people only have very particular interests in those numbers. So it's hard to give it to you in a way that is going to meet everybody's needs. So if we can kind of get a broad spectrum of what that would be, you guys know from the budget presentation, your areas and the services that you pay into. So I would suggest that if you look to that and say, okay, my area J has these services, those are the ones I'm really interested in, and then go look at those service variances. But I'm going to stop there and just see if there's any comment at this point. Overall, the budget variance, I think we're where we would expect to be for the first quarter.
Director Grenier. Oh, and I should note that Director Morris is online.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'd echo what you said. You know, sometimes you can get dropped into the weeds and you don't see the bigger picture. So I think going back to the fundamental purpose of a variance report in the first quarter is really just to say, are we on track? And it's to trigger a reaction if we are not on track, and it's to give us comfort if we are on track. So some sort of summary, and I know that in your previous financial statements, you've kind of had 6 categories, and I've kind of followed those 6 categories to look for variances in the 6 categories over the year and year by year. So it might be useful, given your comments, to take an approach that gives us a summary page that says, maybe following on those 6 categories, to say, here's where we are in those 6 categories. And then if you want the details and dive down into the minutia, we've got that too. The difference is that as a board, we're looking at it from the top down, but as the financial team, you're building it from the bottom up. And we should get to the same point, and we should be using our 10,000 foot level to say, oh, what's going on here, Carla? Or, oh boy, we're glad that everything's in alignment, and you've got the details working up to come to that same conclusion. So that's the feedback I'd give on your request for feedback.
CFO Fox.
So right now, and I think that it is interesting when I think about what I would look at when I looked at a business's financials is those overarching categories with what wages, supplies, fuel, insurance as an organization, you know, how are we spending? So I think that's valuable. The next section that I kind of provided was more of, here's our services. I think the issue with that is you get familiar with, let's say, the departments, and then the departments each have services under them. Following that, I do have the library service, the film commission, solid waste, if you wanted to get into those specifics. But certainly, again, it isn't, even when I present to that level, I'm not going, okay, here's alternative waste collection B, and here's the supplies and all of those details under that. It just literally is alternative waste collection B. Are you guys comfortable with that summary level? And then if you had concerns that it's, you know, out of whack, or are you guys looking for more of a finite detail with that listing of supplies and, you know, all of that? Because my fear is if I put that in here, this becomes a 200-page report. If you had a concern about alternative waste and where the budget was, you could ask me, I could bring you back that information. And I think as far as time and effectiveness, that's the better way. But I'm curious, you know, I'll look for a nod or if I'm on the right track there.
Director Stamer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I echo what Director Grenier is mentioned, but there's a couple of things that I don't fully understand in the way this works, in as much as that when I'm looking through the capital budgets and I'm seeing, you know, on the capital reserve side of things, I'm seeing a bunch of different, you know, for example, under fire, I'm looking at all these red lines. Why is it look like this? You know, I understand about variances. I understand, you know, we're basically into Q2 now. I mean, we're talking about March 31st, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, we're almost halfway through the year. And I mean, I don't normally from you know, from my perspective at the municipal level, we don't have the same type of breakout because obviously we don't have 125 services or 130 services to provide. But to me, I like knowing exactly what you said, Carla, in as much as, you know, where we are today. Are, you know, has there been any anomalies in what where we should be in our expenditures? And also on the revenue side of things, are we in a deficit in as much as that, you know, was there grant money that was supposed to be applied to a certain project and we haven't received it yet? Or there's going to be cost overruns and those kinds of things. I'd like to be able to see that, but I'm not experienced enough to be able to read that in this information.
In this.
And I think what Director Grenier is alluding to is that if some of the members of this committee, myself, I'm speaking for, has difficulty in looking at some of these numbers, I can only imagine what the rest of the board would look at, what they would think if they were doing the same thing. So it's great to have this information, but I'd like more of an explanation why it's like even on just about at the end of the capital budget, when I'm looking at under, like I said, under fire.
Can you
I
give me a page number, Director?
I'm just scrolling here. It's just about at the very end. It's the very end of your full printout. There's the operating budget right off the beginning. So I guess it's, is there page numbers on here? Sorry. I'm looking at, basically, I'm looking at your operating budget jet rate, right at the very beginning of your financial statements. And then we've got all the statements along, and you go just about to the very end. The last page is basically capital budget by department summary categories. And if you back it up just a little bit, you end up seeing a whole bunch of stuff, like there's water sewer, there's also solid waste management, there's library, and all these things are in the red. So what does that mean? I don't understand what that means. I can see, you know, when we look at the percentages on the one of the sheets where it says we're at 19% or 25% or, you know, whatever, but what is the red?
Yeah, thank you. So I think what's confusing it here is there's revenue and expenses. And I think maybe for our presentation purposes, eliminating the revenues might be helpful because the revenues from the system come out as negatives. So I think, yes, so I think that's where it's getting confusing.
I'm just wondering if, I think we had this conversation before, is that you may fully understand this and this is the way you read it, but most of us don't read it this way. We're more concerned about checks and balances. We're more concerned about, you know, on a budget, how much money we have and how much money we're spending and how to make it so that we know that we're either on target or off target. Because again, if we kept it very simple, if all of a sudden we find ourselves that we're under, let's say we're under, for example, and Director Grenier has brought that up numerous times, then we can start thinking, okay, maybe we are putting too much money into this. And again, not trying to take responsibility away from staff, but then the board has more of a feel on having their level of responsibility as well, and not just having a staff recommendation saying, well, at the end of the year, we had an extra $50,000 in development services. Maybe we should do something with it. We'd know that because we would see that. Consequently, if there was a project coming up and we know that we've overspent on that, but we know that the grant has already been applied, we haven't got the check yet, but it's all going to work out. We're on budget. We're on our, you know, we're on schedule, and everything is going to be fine. Then you wouldn't even have to waste a bunch of time looking at it. So.
Yeah. So I think I'm taking away a couple of things. Number one, from the capital report, I think I would eliminate the revenues. The summary for the budget does identify what revenue source is covering that capital. I think you're more interested in this point at the actual expenditure, and it's just muddying the waters. The other thought I was having is upfront, possibly having a summary page that has some comments on it by the department, by the service, and just having like a status comment on it. I think right now, even if you looked at it, it's uneventful. The budget variance is uneventful. The first 3 months, we're doing year end, we're getting caught up. It's business as usual. There's nothing really out of the ordinary. Revenues for the organization don't come in really a majority of that until the summer and after August, because the municipalities of province collects their taxation money and then in August we get it. So you're not seeing the revenues. We are starting in the finance department. What typically happened before is we didn't actually even recognize reserve transfers and things like that more to the end of the year. We're trying to do that a little bit more periodically. So that would make those revenues a little bit more meaningful. But I think overall you're more focused on what the expenditures would be and the variance there. What I can tell you right now is that there's nothing really out of the ordinary. I would say wages sometimes, if you look, it could strike you as looking high because we upfront, the way our payroll system works, we upfront vacation. So all the vacation shows up in the wages in the first month. And then as people take vacation, it starts to dwindle off, and wages would be much lower during the summer months and fall when they're taking vacation. Wage expenses show only a little bit because they're taking vacation out of the vacation bank. Anyway, it's a little bit how we account for things. So there's, you know, some anomalies with that, but nothing out of the ordinary here. What I think I'd like to do is go back to the drawing board with some of my peers and try and come up with something for the second quarter. And we'll try that till we land on something that you guys are feeling that you're getting getting the value that you want to see.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I agree. I mean, the next meeting that we'll be having, I think, would be in September. Is that right? So I think that would be prudent to be able to do that. And whether you have a summary that we have, for the board's, um, opportunity to look at, where you can have a summary of the departments. And it's just an overall summary. And again, it's just a moment in time. Are you on target? Are you on budget? Has there been any surprises? And keep it at a very, very, if somebody wants to talk about utilities or somebody wants to talk about something, they can, and you can pull the information, but we really don't have to get into the weeds. But then that also starts building the next year's budget in that process, because once you get to the halfway point, you kind of get a feel on what's coming for the next 6 months. And you being in control of seeing all the information, you'll get a feel. You'll know that, hey, we've got a spike over here. This is costing us an extra 10% more than we had originally planned for, and this is why. Well, I would much rather hear that information in September than at the end of the year going, and oh, by the way, we got a 20% increase because it was 10% in September and we added another 10% in December. Personally, I would much rather hear the bad news first and say, okay, what can we do to soften the blow? What can we do to massage our way through this? What projects do we need to complete on time, on budget? Those kinds of discussions, Carla, do you know where I'm coming from?
And I think typically with any variance that we couldn't absorb within a budget, a report or a request would come to the board for direction on. So we do try and make you guys apprised of those items as they come. Right now, if you want to go look at a department, at a service, the information is there. I'll upfront a few pages. Just remember always that in a service and financially, you always have the revenue and the expenses. So if you're seeing a lot of a category called revenue and red, and my finance supervisor, he has been formatting these and he didn't like the way that I was showing the negative numbers. So he's put them all in red and they're standing out a little bit more than they would have in the past. So it was a little bit of a shift in how we were presenting the information. But I think for the most part, I've got your points. We're going to go back to the drawing board and put something together, but just be assured that the information still is here. And if you need, you can reach out to me and I can help you dive into the details if you found some details you want to talk about.
Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. The other thing that I think I recognize, this is all work in progress. So in that spirit, it seems to me that another useful report is an age payables and receivables, which is a confirmation that we're paying our bills on time and that we're collecting our non-tax revenue on time. So, if I was looking at something, I'd get concerned if it was 120 days as opposed to 90 days. I'd be asking questions about that. But that's an ancillary report. And then also an ancillary report would be a report on the investment of surplus. And it would simply be, this is what our money is invested in, this debenture, this coupon, whatever it is. And it would be a summation on a quarterly or as you report as you report to us, this is where the money is. And what that demonstrates is that the money is fully invested. It gives the board a sense of the interest that it's earning, and it means that you're on top of it. And that's what we all want, is we want that kind of reporting. So those two ancillary reports, along with what is essentially an expenditure summary and then the expenditure detail that you've talked about, finding that balance is some suggestions on moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll have to give that some thought because as far as payables, we don't really carry our payables. We have a 30-day turnaround on payment. So it's not like we have a payable sitting there. So certainly, yeah, I'll give some thought to how I can bring that forward. And I guess investments as well. I was thinking at first you were focused on the surpluses and I'm like, well, we don't actually even know what our surpluses are fully, and we don't do anything with them at that point. So, but I understand you're talking the reserve funds and the money that's sitting there, and if, is it invested, where is it invested? So, yeah, I'll put some thought to that and see how I can bring that information forward. Are there any other questions in regards to the budget variance?
Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I go through some of these, like street lighting and fire protection, there's a couple others in here that were area M or N or not in there. I know when you go there, fire protection, area M and N are totally different because we operate under contract service instead of a funded fire department. I was wondering where that shows up. It probably isn't in a variance and there's.
Just to clarify, so if I was talking specifically fire protection, are you asking the Merit or M&N Lower Nicola fire protection, where would you see that variance?
Yeah.
So on page 14 of 144 of the agenda package, there is a department called fire. The category name is Fire Protection Merit Lower Nicola. You can see that, yeah, and I think this is where, that's the revenue, so I'm leading you to the wrong section. You gotta go to the expense. Page 17. Jamie, can you give me that page? Just minor. Okay, so where to get it? So yeah, it's presenting the revenues first, and that's why all those negatives, and then it's presenting the expenses in another section. So yeah, on page 17, you would see Merit Lower Nicola. You can see actual spent of $1,800 to a budget of $290 with a variance of 288, and that's just because it's the first quarter and the billings haven't been brought in.
And if I may add,
Yeah.
just that we have a number of service areas that contract with local fire departments. And in terms of accounting practices and how they're shown as a service, they operate the exact same as any TNRD administered fire departments. The difference is we know the exact dollar amount that the contract is for. So there's very little fluctuation in terms of surplus or deficit from operating costs.
I have one other question. I was looking at.
Your
Director
microphone,
Laird, is your
Director.
microphone on?
Can't remember, improvement district is what it is, and from what I understand, the improvement district pays for the street lighting, and then when they send their bill in, it goes directly, TNRD reimburses them. Is that how that works? Or is it something?
Yeah, through the chair. So the improvement district services are not connected with the TNRD at all. So they are a taxing authority, so their service for street lighting and water, they approve a budget similar to the TNRD, and then that goes through to the Ministry of Finance, to the province, and then it shows up on their provincial tax notice. So there's no integration with the improvement district services and the TNRD budget. So we don't even see that on here. It
Yeah.
doesn't exist in our system. We don't touch that money.
And so they're an entirely different operation compared to the regional district.
Exactly. They're a separate level of local government, so
Yeah.
similar to a municipality. They just have very limited services that
Yeah.
they're allowed to provide, but the same, they're independent entity.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Director Grenier.
A specific question. I saw in your detail the alternative waste collection, and I know that we had dealt with that in the budget process. And I'm just wondering if you could steer me on that section called alternative waste collection. I would have thought that would not be there in the detail anymore because it would be folded into the greater waste collection, but I'm missing the point.
Yeah, good question. And through the chair, the curb, if for area J specifically, I'm assuming that's what the question's related to. Our curbside collection service is within the alternate waste service. So we reduced the budget in area J alternate waste because we are no longer funding the operating costs of the 2 transfer stations that were funded through that service. However, our curbside collection is still funded through that service. So those costs are still in that service.
So secondary to that, I saw that the 4 areas or the 4 transfer stations, I'm wondering if the 4 transfer stations are still in there because there were other areas beside area J that were listed in the category called alternative waste. And I'm just thinking it might be a catch up. This was the first quarter and we had the.
Yeah.
We
You mean-
probably.
You mean just because there's a line item? Is that what
Yeah,
you're
there
getting
was,
at? Yeah.
4 line items.
Yeah, it's because it still exists as a line item, so there was some, I think, some surplus carry forward in there that needs to be cleaned up. I could let Carla speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. So for one, the service hasn't been abolished yet, so the service carries over and we're obligated for any surplus. So revenue minus expense, anything that was left over would have to be carried forward to the next year. I was just trying to bring it up quickly here to give you an example. And I think of area N, and area N at the end of last year had a bit of surplus that was brought forward. And basically all of the money that was remaining that was carried forward is going into the reserve for the alternate waste. N, I'm looking at J, we talked about J though, and J is, so there would have been a bit of surplus left. The only thing that's carried forward in J is the curbside collection. And a little bit of cost there, and there was $3,700 worth of surplus that came, or overspend that came in to the revenue section. Cause all you'll see is the net of the amounts. I have all the line item detail, let's say. The alternate waste, B, what were the ones that was N and did B, but B we didn't, B was still there.
Nothing changed.
Yeah.
It was curbside, so it was J and P.
P, what's the other one I was gonna go to?
Just wondering if it makes sense to change the name to a curbside collection now that instead of alternative waste, because before it was encompassing the transfer stations and the pickup. And I think going forward, when you're sorting out the surpluses and the residuals and whatever is left, that's probably a more useful description, if that's what it's capturing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll take that into account going forward, just to make that a little bit more clear. But just looking at the budgets for N and P, 2025 onward has nothing in it. So it's just the carry forward from 23 surplus into the next year to clean that up.
Yeah, that's a good comment because the title of the service is what shows up on the tax notice, so appreciate the comments. Having curbside collection is just more specific so people understand what it is. They may not know what alternative waste means when they see that on their tax notice.
Any more comments or questions? We're good? You're good, CFO Fox? Okay, dokie. Moving on. 5.2. Oh, reserve policy review. Is that you again?
Pardon me?
Are you doing reserve policy review? Thank you.
Yeah, I sure am. And I have a presentation, so I'm just gonna have Justin put it up. Yeah. So as he's preparing that, I'm just gonna talk a little bit about, I've kind of targeted doing an integrated surplus and reserve policy at this point. I started piecing together a draft policy and then I stopped. And I thought we really got to stop and just talk about some of the things that we're looking for and expecting. The previous way that reserves were handled at the TNRD was in a way that, thank you. Every capital reserve we were creating a capital reserve bylaw. And when I came in, coming from the municipality, I thought that was strange because you don't typically have to create a bylaw unless it's a statutory reserve. I think the thought here was because they believed it was a restricted reserve, because they wanted to make sure the reserve for that area was only being used for that area. However, the legislation already states that. It says that the money earned in an area has to stay in the area. So having the capital bylaw is just an extra step. And if you can imagine, with 120 reserves and to have a capital bylaw, and then on top of that, every time they used money from the bylaw, they created a bylaw. The administration behind that and to bring that to the board, for what purpose? You've already saw the board report. We typically are using reserves to fund capital. You can see the capital plan. We disclose which reserves are funding which piece of capital. We're disclosing all of that information up front. It's a lot of make work. So what I'm proposing, and I'll take you through this, but we'll see an overarching reserve policy that gives those parameters that the board wants to see. Eliminate all these individual ones, because I can tell you, as staff turnover and new people come on, there are so many policies and bylaws that you have to be familiar with. It is really, and then service establishments that have rules in them as well. It's not for the fault of not wanting to, it's impossible to be up and understand everything that's out there that you have to guide, follow that guides your work. So it's important to do that in a way that is going to be, they say SMART goals and objectives, you know, specific, measurable, realistic. It's not realistic to think every time somebody new comes in, they're going to be familiar right away with all your policies. So how can we do this in a way that gives you guys assurance that it's guiding our practices the right way, and that we're up on all the right guiding principles. The other area we're going to talk about is surplus, and some of I was almost going to get into that conversation when Director Grenier started talking about surplus, and I'm like, no, I have that in the next section, and we'll do that. So I'm going to lead you through just a series of slides to kind of lead the conversation. And at the end of this, for our next meeting, what I'm going to do, I'm down the path already of building a policy, but I want to take in everything that we kind of land on today and help that form it a bit more before I put that in front of you guys. So the reserves are really the funds set aside for specific future needs or contingencies. We don't really here overly look at contingencies or emergent situations. We're really focused on just the capital need or what's in front of us. Prior to this last year, we were only budgeting out for capital and those types of projects 1 year at a time. So we weren't really forward thinking about investing into the reserves or talking about that. Financial resources are allocated to the specific services, and we ensure that they can address unforeseen expenses, planned projects, or obligations without impacting its regular operating budget. So one of the purposes of taking that capital budget out of operating is so taxes don't jump around. You understand, especially with the hospital district, how much capital fluctuates and jumps around. We don't want that to affect our taxes. So a way of doing that is to understand what we need in our capital from reserves and do transfers to reserves that are a consistent contribution year over year, helping keep the tax rate stable. The development of a single overarching reserve policy to help provide, of course, a specific purpose. Is there legal restrictions? It's helping with that financial stability, really about transparency and accountability. And all the documentation that I've been giving to you is pretty much all the documentation that I haven't worked with. I have really held nothing back. I'd say the biggest complaint right now is I'm giving too much information and people can't get through it all. The strategic planning part of this is thinking about what you guys and your initiatives are when you come into term and what are the strategies we're trying to accomplish, and also to make sure that there's investment there to address those needs as well. And that's something we haven't done, I'd say from my experience in local government, we don't always do very well because we do the strategic planning, but it's really arm's length from your financial plan. What really should happen is, does your strategic plan require financial investment? And then make sure that you're approving that financial investment in the financial plan. And that's how, then we're not trying to fight the system when you guys aren't getting movement on some of your objectives because we haven't actually built in resources for it. Hope that makes sense. The reserve policy really should have guidelines for use, limits on withdrawals, a replenishment mechanism, reviewing it regularly, and public reporting. And I give you all this and I kind of cringe because it's almost a full-time job for somebody to oversee the reserves like this on an ongoing basis. There's so many to keep balanced. It's probably the biggest difference between my municipal career and my regional district career is trying to manage all the funds. So just a snippet of this again. Remember, we have the revenue and, the capital reserves and the operating reserves, how we've kind of broken them out here. And it's just showing you by department. I just want to remind you it's there, remind you the balances that have been in there from when we presented the financial plan and over the 5-year. The trend from my perspective, when I first came in, it was kind of trending in almost like a rainbow. And what I want to have happen is the reserves not to go down. So when we have a long-term asset management plan, it will really help us understand what's our base level we need in the reserves, how should we maintain that? Every time we have new assets, we've got to contribute into the reserves. We haven't really done a good job where it's like, oh, we have a fire truck replacement. Let's start putting away money year after year. So we started introducing that last year, and you'd really see in the fire department budgets, transfers to reserves coming into play so that we have some money there. But overall, what you want to do is you want to say, I have a fire truck, it's going to cost me $500,000 and we're going to borrow 250 of that. And we're going to make sure there's enough in reserve for 250 over those 5 years. Or we want the full amount and we don't want to borrow. So we need to put, if you aren't willing to tax for the amount of reserve that you need for 5 years to pay for a truck in 5 years, then we have to agree that we need to borrow or find some other opportunity there. So it's about looking at each project and determining how you're going to fund that and then building a plan for that. Right now, that work is so cumbersome that to do that with every capital item we have with the board, that's not realistic. So having the board set kind of parameters. Right now, we're going to do it based on reasonability and best practice. Because what they say is at least have the amount of your amortization in a reserve. Or at least for operating, have 10% of your operating expenses in a contingency reserve. So just have you get to a comfort level of setting parameters like that. And then I have to go back with Austin and we have to calculate, are we at that? Are we not at that? What's the gap? How much is that going to cost us? So I'm going to do as much as I possibly can on that prior to us going into budgeting. And September is when we go really back to the staff and start deliberating budget and looking at trends of what we've spent and those different things. So that's what we're going to start to look at then. But in order for me to build a proper reserve strategy, we might have to adopt a strategy that won't fully be implemented because I don't actually have the time to address every capital project and 120 reserves. So we have approximately 121 reserve accounts. Right now, they range from capital to operating or grant specific reserves, such as the Community Building Fund. We created a reserve for that. Or the LGCAP, the Local Government Climate Action Initiative funds. So we have a couple of reserves that are just very specific to what the grant is because we haven't allocated that to a service. Other than that, They are specific services with operating and capital reserves. There's Parkland Dedication Reserve, a DCC reserve is more a restricted reserve that would have a bylaw that's statutory. So just to give you an idea, we have approximately equivalent amount of reserve bylaws out there that no one reviews on a regular basis. And they're very general and all say very similar things. So what I propose to do as we move forward is get rid of all of those individual bylaws, make sure that our new policy captures all the things that you want to say. Already knowing that we don't have to say again, you can only use the reserve for that specific service. Legislation already says that. Okay, so you're not trying to duplicate what rules are already there. Sometimes you want to do that for if you're trying to speak outwardly to the public and make sure that they know that you're following those rules. The ministry opinion there basically says what I've told you. You only need a reserve to have a bylaw if you want it to be a statutory reserve. So I've just shown that we've reached out to the ministry and they gave us our opinion. That is why I'm bringing that forward, and really to alleviate a lot of the work that was being done for no reason. And there was reason, I should clarify. To them, there was good reason at the time, but my understanding and the opinion I've got is you don't need that. You're already protected. Go ahead, Dr. Rickler.
What comes under statutory reserves? What sort of project how can you, I just wondered what a statutory reserve is, because that's the only one you need a bylaw for.
So if you think of your development cost contributions, or your parkland reserve, cemetery contribution reserve, lots of times there's, when people run cemeteries, you have to put money into contingency reserve for cemeteries, and they have those statutorily. Really, what the statutory status means is that there's some legislation or rule that says you have to do this and you have to have it for a specific purpose. So if you sell land, the money you receive from the land sale has to go back into a land reserve because based on the legislation. So that's statutory. We don't have a lot. Municipalities have typically more than we have because they have a bigger list of services that they provide under that. But I know for us, we have a development cost charge reserve and we have a land reserve.
So for instance, the property that we're looking at in the Ashcroft area that is in the solid waste funding, would that go to a statutory land reserve, or how did, because we're talking about selling that piece of land?
Yeah, so
Just an example of how it would work.
The land sale would go into a land reserve. Typically, if the funds used, and I have to do a little bit of research on that. If the funds are used from that service to purchase the land, I would suspect that the funds stay with that service. If it was regional funds that were used to purchase, you could probably go back and peel that apart a little bit. But we certainly can bring that information forward to you for that discussion.
So as far as I understand, the solid waste did purchase the land, so then if you sell it, it would go back into that. Is that how it would work?
Yeah, so through the chair, confirming, yes, the solid waste service did purchase the land the Boston Flats Eco Depot is on now. I think what we need to confirm is whether it must go into the solid waste service or whether the board has any ability to redirect that if they wanted to. But yeah, I would agree with CFO Fox that the default, and our past practice has been, the default is whoever pays for it, whatever service pays for it, any revenue from the sale of that or other revenue would go back in that service. So using another example in solid waste, we're leasing property to Trans Mountain, and the revenue from that lease goes back into solid waste, offsetting taxation in that service.
So this, of course, I don't expect you to read that. It's really tiny. But again, within your budget document, there is a reserve schedule and lists every reserve we have with the 5-year outlay on those reserves. We have capital plan, and what that capital plan shows you, if you look at it, there's a reserve column or funding column, and it tells you how we plan to fund that. So just want to show you that the information is there that we present, that you can see where money is coming from for the reserve. Now, I look at this and I have to look at it for days and hours on time at a time, and I'm much more intimately familiar with the numbers and what's going in and out. It wasn't until last year that I had a uniform capital template that's linked to the funding strategy that all my department managers could access and share the same information. So, you know, it's still a bit of a work in process because we're bringing in information from the different departments and trying to make sure it's all feeding into this one capital plan. And then on top of that, we're layering in, we're moving down the path of asset management. And lots of times, just to give you an example of the difference, financially, we have to capture the cost of assets. And that's our tangible capital asset listing. Asset management can be much more detailed. I don't capture assets that are under $5,000. You may want in an asset management plan a more granular level of assets and more detail and condition assessments. So really, we're trying to build an asset management system that has granular detail with historic value, that at the end of it all, those numbers will match to our financial system. But it's a big undertaking to get to that point, and we are not there. So we have a GIS system that captures information on the ground for our assets, and we're going to build on that, and we're going to spend a lot of time trying to pair the two together. And the more that you get involved in this asset management conversation that we're bringing to you, have a little bit more of an understanding. But right now, the financial system tracks our tangible capital assets. But we don't worry as much about historical value. We're really focused on how much has the asset amortized and what's its book value. So it's a bit different than, oh, we have a piece of equipment and we know if we repair and maintain that every 3 years, we'll extend the life of that piece of equipment longer. That's a different focus from what I do financially. So trying to marry those two together. And in that piece of work comes the proper investment for future capital. So when I say there's a gap in our reserves to properly fund our asset management plan, it's because that plan is much more cumbersome. It's much more holistic to think about all of the stuff that you have to invest into assets to maintain them and keep them going long term. And it's one of the reasons our utilities and our utility costs had to swing so much, because we got grants, we implement water treatment plants and systems. And then in that plan, an asset management plan would have you do a total impact assessment and not have a service go forward without consideration of all the investment that it takes to maintain and replace that system. So if you know that system in 20 years is going to need to be replaced, over the next 20 years, you decide, okay, we're going to pay for half of it and half of it will be grants. So we have to make sure we have $4 million available in 20 years or $8 million. So how much do we have to put away to pay for that? So we have to have those plans in place. We do that very disjointed right now. We don't really have a structured system. So I have to bring you a reserve policy and strategy that addresses more of an overarching approach, just like we talked about with percentages. 10% or, you know, half of our year's amortization, or we're going to, a water system's amortization is $250,000 a year. We want to make sure we have $500,000 or a $250,000 contribution to our reserve every year to make sure. So I saw there was probably a question. Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The asset management plan, it sounds to me like if we don't have the asset management plan, which we're going to start working on, it's very hard to do the other part of the reserve funds and how they're being spent. So if we get the asset management plan built, it'll automatically blend into the capital reserve and any surpluses. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I'd like to create a policy right now that's vague enough to allow us to operate and give you guys enough confidence of what we're doing. And then once the asset management plan comes into play, might be more specific. So you might say, rather than 10%, you might say, I want 250,000, or I want 2 times or 3 times my amortization invested every year, because we'll have, you know, a much better idea of what we need for that replacement 2, 5, 10, 15 years out. It gives us much more specific information to work with to make guidelines and decisions. So it's a bit of a challenge if you want something really specific, because we don't understand what our gap is right now. We don't understand what the dollar amount is that we aren't properly funding. We only have some idea of the current. So I added animation to these slides, so I hope you appreciate that, because I thought at this point I need something to keep you awake. So things bouncing in on the screen might be helpful. Okay, so what I've tried to do is I didn't want to blanket or put a question out to you guys and not have some sort of solution or answer, but give you guys the opportunity to say, no, I don't agree with that, or yeah, I want that, plus I want this. So I thought this was a way to lead the conversation. So the goals and objectives, what are the primary goals and objectives you want this policy to achieve? How do you envision the policy supporting the long-term financial stability of the regional district? So my spiel of what I was just saying is really my vision of what I'm trying to create and what I want it to achieve. I want it to, in the end, address that long-term financial need, and whether we say we can't tax enough to cover this amount, but we want to have at least 25%. And then we'll find grants or we'll try and capture other funding sources for this. At least that gives us a path to work with and some numbers to work with. So because right now we're doing nothing. We're doing very, very little investing into reserve funds. The one for sure thing we do is we invest the interest earned on reserves back into the reserve. And we do have specific areas where we're making contributions, intentional contributions, but very few.
Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to raise a couple things that dovetail into what you had said earlier, because it's big picture stuff. And then I'd like to be able to focus on this specifically. But you had said it's almost impossible for a new person to come in and understand everything that's going on and all the rest of it. I can tell you as a new director, 27 directors, and I have a bit of a finance background, so it was perhaps easier for me than others to get a handle of this. But boy, there's a lot to get a handle on. And so when I'm thinking about how do we take all of this information and make it useful for the 27 people that are at this board, we have to, you use a different acronym, but keep it simple, stupid, the KISS principle. We have to really look at it from that bigger picture. And that comes right down, I think, to defining right at the get-go, what is a surplus and what is a reserve? How do you get to surplus? And then how does it become a reserve? So the first comment, which we dealt with, struggled in the first year, was this business of surplus and reserve. The other thing that we did is we asked for a SWOT analysis at the beginning. And what the SWOT analysis did is you took that back to your departments, and each department went through the whole process, and it's sort of like a recalibration of budget. Really, at the end of the day, it's a recalibration of budget. And then you came back and you said, for my default, I'm going to use a 10% surplus number. Okay, so we have brand new board that's struggling with surplus and reserve, what that means. We've got a set of numbers that is being presented to this board that says this is what the cost is on an annual basis to run these different departments. We've drilled down, we've done our savings and we've added a 10% surplus, a 10% surplus number to it. And we know under legislation that any surplus that results at the end of the year automatically goes back into revenue the next year. So we can't help ourselves. Anything that we overcharge is going back in the next year into the budget. And so our relationship to the taxpayer is that even if we've resulted in extra money, unspent money, that unspent money, don't worry, Mr. Taxpayer, it's going back next year into the overall thing unless we do something different with it. So this repeating mechanism is on default. And I love the idea of the 10% number or a number, because we don't have to think about anything except anomalies. Maybe it should be 15 in this category. Maybe it should be 35. Maybe it should be 250. Whatever the number, if we know that you're running with a 10% number and we know that any surplus is automatically going in the next year into revenue, we don't have to think about that. We just have to think about the differences. And we've become educated as directors as to what the surplus is, and that we don't have to worry about that cycle unless we say, hey, we want to buy a fire truck or we want to do something special. Now we have to start thinking about where does money come from? And it's a thought process to put the money from here into the reserve thing. So I really think it's useful if we start off with, like you've provided examples of what this policy is trying to do. I think we have to have that opening statement about what is it we are trying to do as a board, what the direction we're going, that keep it simple process. I think that that's really important as the opening section to what is our goals and objectives. Now, we've also, as a board, put in a 5-year plan that wasn't there before. Now we got a 5-year plan. We got a framework on which we can start planning the reserves. And you've just talked about assets. We got a whole bunch of assets that we have to hang on that schedule and figure out where we're going. But at least the board is now becoming accountable to the taxpayer for every dollar that it says we need this to come out of your pocket, out of your property tax pocket for these things. And I really think that is an important first step for the board, for the staff, and for the policy, so that the policy really is explaining this difference. You got your annual numbers and your annual services, and then if you want to layer on top of that fire trucks, fire halls, water treatment plants, whatever it is, you've got to deal with that. The one thing I want to ask in the summary, you said you quoted section 377, and what I've been hearing for 2 years is that there's a difference between municipalities and regional districts in the way that they have flexibility in their reserves. And in 370, you quote section 377 and 70, I think what it says is it requires that each area of the regional district separate reserves for each service in that area. Is that correct or not?
Yes, so every service has its own separate reserves that stay within that service.
Okay, so at the end of the day, your sheet that you showed, the big sheet that's detailed, that sheet is driven by the regional district areas and the distinction between a regional district area and a municipality.
So the reserve list that we have, every reserve, you can tie to a service establishment bylaw. When I worked in a municipality, you don't have service establishment bylaws. So every service establishment bylaw establishes a service. Okay. And those reserves, if you create a reserve for, dog control, animal control, that has a service establishment bylaw with parameters around it. And then you're creating a reserve or a capital or an operating reserve underneath that service. And if that service earns enough money that they can put money into a reserve, that reserve belongs to that service.
So that bylaw that you've talked about, the elimination of the paperwork and all the rest of it, does that undermine the separate nature of these things? We still have the distinction that that money was raised in Area J for that particular purpose. You're
Absolutely.
just saying that we don't have to have this layering of documentation.
You
Okay.
don't need another document to say the same thing that's already captured within legislation.
Okay. All right. That's great. Thank you very much for that. The only other thing I'll say is that I think we should have a preface of this document along with what is definition of surplus and reserve that talks about that the purpose of the reserve policy is to, as you said, specify future needs or contingencies. And you made the comment, we really don't do a lot of contingencies. I think in an emergency, you could put aside money for emergencies, not knowing what they are specifically. But the point of the reserve policy is to set money aside for specific things, not non-specific things.
I think that you could make an argument there that, let's say in a fire department, you know, a pump goes on a truck and it costs $40,000 and you can't plan for that. And it's just a replacement of a pump and it's not capital, it's really operating. And if you have to tap into your operating budget that's already small and come up with $40,000, that'd be very difficult. So typically what you might have is an operating contingency that sits there to address. You might have 10% of your operating budget. Let's say it's $400,000, you have $40,000 in an operating contingency, so that the board could make a decision to access those funds to cover that one-time expenditure. So it's not taking away from your ongoing operations. So from that perspective, you could have in your policy that we are going to have a contingency of 10% of operating to address emergent needs within operations. Even if that's there, if you don't include that $40,000 in the budget, we would have to come to the board. So if it's not defined in the operating budget, I can't just go to the reserve and pull it out and say, oh, we had an operating contingency that we need the money for. We would actually have to go to the board because you haven't approved the spending. So we can only spend what you've approved. So even there's a safeguard where we would have to come back, ask you to do a budget amendment and give us access to these funds.
Director Stamer.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I totally understand where Carla's coming from on the contingency end of things, because I think what we found even in the last few years is by trying to fine tune a lot of these items, we're finding that we're having cost overruns because we weren't able to identify or realize some of the additional costs that affected our overall budget. And I think that's why I like to keep it simple, stupid, in as much as that, as long as we're able to maintain a healthy bottom line, at the same time being cognizant of the fact that we shouldn't be putting, money into reserve that is not really for a specific purpose. By what we've done in the past has allowed us to have the flexibility to shift some of our asset management skills because of having the flexibility in the budget. And I'm afraid that if we end up trying to fine tune it too much, we'll find ourselves, even if we decide that a contingency should be 10%, all of a sudden it becomes 20%. Now we're in a real pickle because we've turned around and shifted away from what we were doing in the past. COVID showed us an example of that. I was in this room when we agreed to reduce our budget, and we are still paying for that because we did that. Luckily, we didn't do it any more than we did. Some municipalities consistently, basically almost shut the tap off. And now they're looking at significant increases at a time when people can barely put food on the table. And unfortunately, it was a little bit short-sighted at that time. And I think a lot of people made an emotional decision when really the accountants in the room said, if you do this, it's gonna be here. And I think I appreciate where Ms. Fox is coming from on a lot of this, is that if we start trying to fine tune too much in what we're deciding to do with reserves and surpluses, we'll find that we will have less flexibility going forward. And that's why, again, I come back to the point a few minutes ago when we were talking about where we are on variances, is that if we have a pretty good understanding of how this business works, where our revenue streams are, understanding that we better start shifting some of our focus away from grants and looking at other opportunities, we may find that even if there is a grant available in the foreseeable future, if we don't have the reserves in place, we won't even be able to apply for those grants. Because the other levels of government are starting to get into the same situation where they don't have the flexibility. They have a shrinking pool of money being available for infrastructure. And if we don't have money set aside, even if it isn't for a specific purpose, we won't be able to plug into those grants because we will not have the money set aside to be able to do that. That may be my opinion, but I think that's what's coming down the pipe.
CFO Fox and then Director Grenier.
Yeah, I think Director Stamer just captured it well, the essence of what we're trying to accomplish. So I don't think I have any more to add to that.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not suggesting that we have to be specific on every dollar that's coming out. What I'm saying is if we decided that we needed a reserve for fire, I'm not suggesting today that we need to be able to pick fire truck and turnout gear and all the rest of that sort of stuff. It's the dollar figure that we are planning over the 5-year period for fire. But it's for fire. It's not for rutabagas or whatever. And my concern is that when we create a reserve policy, your idea of it being it's specific and then maybe something for a contingency. We have an earthquake and part of the, the hospital falls down. We're going to have some kind of emergency contingency. We don't know what the emergency is. We don't know what we would spend it on, but it is an emergency contingency. And I think we could sell that to taxpayers that we're prepared. But it's not, so we've got your fire things, your specific things, and then you've got one line item that is to deal with very, what I'll call emergency, but it's available for you when you think it's really important to dip into it. In some of your examples, they have something called an opportunity surplus. And that's just taxation without being specific. And I think we should avoid that. We shouldn't be creating a pool of money other than say for emergency that doesn't have any specifics, that's amorphous. And the reason I say that is that we had a former director come in here several meetings ago and was explaining that in his time, a whole lot of this stuff was put in by a previous administration to fund a KXA thing, like a replacement for KXA. That's why the reserve was there. That's what we were doing, so on and so forth. Well, we're the new council. We don't have any documentation that says that's why it was being created. It was a bit of a slush fund that was being created. So I think in the creation of the surplus and reserve, we maintain the flexibility to do what we want, but we make sure that we're not creating just another slush fund, an opportunity fund. I think an emergency fund is appropriate, but I don't think a slush fund is appropriate without going back to the taxpayer and saying, we're going to take more money out because we don't have a purpose for it, but we just want more money.
I have Director Stamer, then Director Thorpe. And can we try not to call it a slush fund, please? Try not to call it a slush fund, please. Yeah, well, having survived last term, just don't do that.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. I totally agree with Director Grenier. But again, there's a purpose for reserves, but there's also a purpose for a surplus within that reserve. And I think that we want to be able to convey to our taxpayers that you put us in these chairs to be able to make those decisions on the go. And we are hopefully able to make an informed decision, a decision that's going to represent the wishes of the electorate. And I totally agree with you. You shouldn't be having money put aside just for the sake of putting money aside. But we still have to be able to have a certain percentage of flexibility in our plan so that if something comes up, we don't have to go to the taxpayers and say, hey, we can't unlock this money that we've already reserved. We can stretch out, what was prudent planning, say in a fire department, and we were going to buy a new truck in 3 years. Well, we've decided we're going to actually stretch it over 5 years because we got to build a new fire hall. Whatever that reasoning is. I totally get it. And that's why I think the board has acted responsibly in the past, and hopefully we can continue. And I totally agree with what Director Grenier is mentioning, is that, yes, we want to make sure that those silos are intact, but still have the flexibility within those silos, and then also know exactly what we're actually saving the money for. I totally agree with you.
Director Thorpe.
Okay, maybe I'm missing the mark here somewhere. I'm agreeing with what Director Stamer said earlier about the flexibility. We are a regional district, and I think that our reserve funds have to be very specific. We don't have the so-called flexibility maybe that the municipalities do. So I think when we set up these reserve funds, we need to be very prudent and careful that we have flexibility within each of those reserve funds so that we can take these opportunities. If it's a grant that comes and we have to match it in kind by 50% to be able to do something for a water system, that we can do it. So I think that can be explained to taxpayers. I'm sorry, Director Grenier, but the idea of an emergency reserve fund, I'm going to say reserve, not slush, being there, I'm not sure if we can do that, given that we have to be a little more specific as a regional district. Am I on the right track?
No, you actually, as long as you. So. I've got a few thoughts. One is that if you put money into reserve, you have every. It's within the board's power to put whatever money they want in a budget in the reserve. Whether that has been identified for something in particular, other than if it follows the capital bylaw right now, it's specifically for capital. That's basically the general thing. So if you make a decision, your financial plan says, I'm going to put $250,000 into a reserve for capital, but you have identified nothing, it doesn't matter. You can do that. When capital comes up, what I can say is that every service that has capital, we haven't really had a good replacement plan. So almost every dollar in our reserve can be used on our current capital. But it hasn't specifically been identified until we put a 5-year plan in front of you and you said, oh, okay, and here's where the funding could come from for this. So I have a 5-year funded plan, and it's coming from these specific places. So you endorsed now something more specific. Before, it wasn't as specific. So we still have the ability to have money in reserve that's not specified. Putting a policy in place is allowing you more acknowledgement, more confidence that when we do put money in there, it is going in for a specific purpose, or it's going to be used for something very specific.
Director Laird, then Director Grenier again? No, I didn't see, okay. Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We all know that there's a strong possibility that we're going to be looking at financing the upcoming cancer clinic that's proposed. This is under the Regional Health Board, obviously. How do you know that there's going to be a substantial contribution coming with our 40% involvement in capital? How do you actually start putting money aside for something like that? Can you do that, or how do you, would that be an increase in the Regional Health Board tax to sort of offset the cost of borrowing at a later date? It's
So
just a scenario of something that we know might happen.
Is your question specific to what's happening in the hospital district or just in general?
we do know that we're going to have funds, 40% of the cost, capital costs of that building coming from the regional hospital district. But it could relate to building the library. We know we gotta have, if we're gonna build another library, we're gonna need X number of dollars. Can you start collecting that from the taxes now to put into the reserve fund, and it's specifically for that project?
Yes, and I'm actually doing that now because we have a 5-year funded capital plan. So I know in that capital plan in 5 years, I need to pay for something. So right now, when I say it's a 5-year funded plan, it means I have funds available to pay for all of it that's in it. Whether it's some we've said we can't go forward unless it's grant funded. Some we've said it's gonna be grant and tax, some is all, or reserves, some is all reserves, but by that reserve there, I know that it's completely linked to my reserve schedule. And I can see when I put in capital, if my reserve goes into negative, I know I have to contribute to that reserve from that service. So right now, that's a huge piece of work. Took me hundreds of hours to put together. We don't have a system that links that together, right? So it allows us for real-time planning. But I want to shoot that out another 10 or 5 years to have a 10-year plan. But of course, then I have to have the matching operating plan and I have to have your guys' buy-in and investment. One thing, or did I answer your question there? You can, yes. Sorry, I started rambling on about other things.
The question, when you collect taxes for a specific capital project and the project doesn't go ahead, where does that go back into reserve fund? Or? does it
So
stay in the
typically,
capital fund?
what we're doing as a staff is continually moving something. So the plan that's 1 year out is certain, and if anything changes in there, we bring that forward to you. The 5-year plan, as things shift and change, we might have to bump things around, and what we do is then next year we bring you another plan and some of the numbers may have shifted and changed. We don't take the time to bring every shift and change to you. We present you a whole plan because we don't have the time to do that. So we make those decisions internally of priority, and then we're bringing that plan forward for you again to endorse. Really, you're endorsing 1 year at a time with the plan that in 5 years, this is what's going to happen.
Director Stamer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a quick point here is that I appreciate where Director Laird is coming from because I know we're all trying to make sure that we find ways of funding projects, but maybe tomorrow will be a good opportunity to ask this question, but again, the Lower Mainland doesn't pay for capital projects like we're talking about at the cancer care facility. And I'm a little bit, I mean, the election's right around the corner, so I'm a little reluctant to actually even be talking about this because what I'm not really too comfortable with is with us trying to get ahead of it, making sure that we don't have a bunch of sticker shock for our residents. If we do have to come up with a portion of the 359, or quite frankly, I don't believe in that number because I think the way that progressive design build is totally flawed in the process, but that's not up to me to decide. Is by having money set aside for something like this, and then all of a sudden having an authoritative body, whoever is the provincial government, to say, well, you guys are already on this track. You already got, you know, $40 million saved up or whatever that number is. Yeah, we're just going to turn around and take it from you. So I'm just a little bit leery on even having that type of discussion. I know that where Director Laird is coming from, because I think as a board, we've been very responsible in our finances. That's why we haven't had some of the sticker shock that some of the other regional districts have in the province because of the way that we've managed the system, even though there was obvious flaws in the way things were done before Ms. Fox came along. So kudos to her and staff for trying to right the ship. But at the same time, I'm just a little bit uncertain as we go forward in the next few months, how we're going to be addressing some of these things, because again, those costs are not finite costs. I think they're going to be the same as what we had with the hospital expansion. I think every single one of us in this room and the board was very disappointed with that meeting with Interior Health when they said, oops, you guys owe us a whole bunch more money. I don't think anybody in this room was comfortable with that, knowing that we acted responsibly. We made sure that everything was done properly, and then they turn around and come along with for more money. So I'm not really too sure how that's going to work out this time.
Director Grenier. Oh, you want to comment first?
No, my only comment is I've been kind of having the conversation grow organically. I do have like 14 more questions. And I'm running really low on time. So obviously I don't want to rush you guys. And I know we've kind of tangented on talking about the hospital district a little bit and capital in general. Once Director Grenier goes, there's probably a lot of things where the questions will come up that we've already discussed. So I'll just rephrase what I think I've heard and we'll kind of move forward. I really do want to save some time for the surplus conversation at the end. And that comes after the questions.
Okay, keep it short. Oh, that's real short. Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah, so back to you.
Okay, so I think in our comments, I do hear that the purpose is really important. Definition between the reserve and the surplus is important to help people understand. And we want to really make clear what we're trying to do and trying to say within our goals and objectives. So the scope and coverage, which types of reserves and surpluses should be included in the policy, operating capital, risk mitigation reserves, and are there specific funds or departments that need distinct reserve policies? So I'm just going to capture, I think distinct reserve policies are needed when there's statutory reserves like development cost charges, and we'll continue to do those. I have proposed having an operating capital, a capital section, and possible risk mitigation. Sometimes calling it contingency is frowned upon, with a specific purpose to address emergent situations, not a slush or a surplus. And as far as the opportunity costs go, I think sometimes there's two different things that happen. One, I don't know in what we're trying to achieve that that's a direction that I would take us at this point. Just being able to address emergent situations, emergencies, pumps that go down, that would be my goal. Or in operating to say, you know, a fire department has 10% in an operating contingency, something reasonable and realistic. An opportunity cost sometimes comes up when changing political whims happen as well, because I have been in situations where strategic plans happen and they have plans that they want to accomplish. And lots of times this happens in municipalities. They have plans that they want to accomplish. And because there's no money set aside, they're always told no. So sometimes boards or councils have created opportunity or reserves so that they can address their sometimes what we deem as shiny projects that they want to do in their term. So sometimes that comes to play. I don't know that we have that. I think that more came in when you're looking at all the different reserve policies out there and some of the options that are out there. So I think that just came up in that.
Director Stamer, then Director Grenier.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know we've got a big meeting here, but the one thing that you touched on, Carla, and I just want to go back on it is I'm looking on page 10 and on the integrated surplus and reserve policy review, and it talks about the surpluses, and it says here to the point of what should they do, how should the TNRD manage surplus funds, and it says staff will either maintain expenditures at status quo or make slight adjustments which result in the surplus revenue reducing the amount of taxation required, or staff may make a decision to transfer reserve revenues to a reserve by the way of reserve transfer expenses. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but all I know is at the municipality of Barrier, if there's going to be any surplus monies, it has to go to our board, to our council for that approval process. So if it's within a budget and we have parameters in that budget and you end up having to move something in that budget and it still meets the budget requirements, that's fine. No different than a CAO only has up to $10,000. And I'm just using this as an example from a small municipality, has the ability to go up to $10,000 without council's approval if it's in a budget. Okay, so you could be totally dead against what the CAO is doing, but if it's in the budget and he wants to spend $9,900, he can do that. I'm wondering how this goes so that we have a mechanism in place. So if there are surpluses where whatever those numbers are, it goes back to the board. So the board ends up making the decision, not staff. So I'd like a little bit, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to tell me now, but that's just the concern that I have, is that the back of the hair of my neck goes up when I see something like that. Not that I don't trust staff, it's just that that should be a mechanism that the board is responsible for, not staff.
Do you want to just take that under advisement for later or answer?
Well, I'll just give a little bit of perspective. So, basically capturing current practice as to what might happen. And one thing I think about is previously some of the surplus was being accumulated based on a project that wasn't undertaken. So what we did is we brought back to the board, okay, these surpluses, some of them exist because they belong to capital. Where those belong to capital, and now that we're moving the capital out to a separate capital plan, we're going to move those surplus funds to a reserve to support that capital that it was originated from. So some of that practice was happening with having conversations with the board, but not specific reports. What I would caution is that the policy needs to give guidelines that give you comfort, but don't hand strap us because there are 124 reserves and I do not have the time to bring every surplus to the board. So what would happen is if you said, and we're going to get into the surplus conversation, but if you said anything outside of 10% of operating needs to come as a discussion, what my proposal is, we bring you a report that says, here's our anticipated surplus of what there would be. These are all within 10% of the operating. These 5 are not. This is why. Is that acceptable? And you could have another level in a policy that says anything in excess of the 10% of surplus, we want transferred to that services reserve. And we would do a cleanup and transfer whatever was over that 10% to a reserve. That happens. And then you have 10% left that's carried forward and goes against the typical process that happens here is that reserve just gets carried forward to the next year's revenue and it reduces the taxation. So anyway, that was kind of this is what we're doing, and we're making some of those decisions liberally within a certain boundary. I wouldn't say anything is out to lunch or it's all above board, but it is definitely not coming individual decisions based on a report. The parameters that I want us to have in a policy will help give you the assurance that anything in excess is going to have a purpose or anything in excess is coming to the board for decision or direction. Okay.
Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. I think you captured it. You need a modest amount of flexibility to do the things you need to do, and you don't need to be encumbered by that. What Director Stamer is saying is, wait a second, we want to know when you're outside of those parameters, and we are accountable to the taxpayer for when you're outside of those parameters, and we have to have a say so. So the idea of smoothing and all the rest of it within your 10%, yeah, beyond that, I personally am not on for that because I'm accountable to the taxpayer about that. And in our surplus and reserve policy, we need to make sure, I think, that the spirit of that is captured, particularly as it goes to reserve. And this, we don't like the word slush. None of us like the word slush, but opportunity fund sounds better than slush, but that's what it is. An opportunity fund is something that doesn't have any specifics, that's used there for shiny projects, as you said, and that's what we want to avoid. I could buy an emergency fund that had a set amount of money that says, you know what, the sky fell and we have to deal with it, but it's a capped amount and it's only for those purposes and we have to be accountable for that. Beyond that, everything else should be specific. And that way we have comfort knowing and can say to the taxpayer, when we need more money, it's for this purpose and only for that defined purpose. So I'm in tune with you on that. Thank you. And
Sure.
thank you for that point about being accountable on anything that's outside of the norm.
Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My experience, as if you want to call it opportunity fund, over the years in my history of being dealing with public funds, you always need some source of funds to be able to do a project that just an opportunity comes. And I've seen, even in my experience, we have no money to actually take advantage of something that brand new has come along. And I don't know how you address that. But I feel it's something that we really need, whether you call it opportunity fund or whatever. And it does go to the board for approval as to that this is the project that we want to do and that this is the funds that just appeared. Not in our budget, not anywhere in sight, but we still want to do that. That's the shiny things. But if we don't have, it's usually 25% is what you need for the provincial government or whatever grant to kick in. So if you don't have that 25%, you can't access that particular new opportunity that's come along. So I don't know how you address that, but I think it's very important that we have that in there just for specific projects, and they always come back to the board for approval. But you're not going to our financial staff and saying, look at this opportunity just comes along. We need $100,000 so we can get another 300,000, and there's no 100,000. And I've experienced that.
Me, then CFO Fox, then Director Thorpe. I'll keep this short. I just agree with Director Laird. CFO Fox, did you want to speak about bond or sure? I'll go to Director Thorpe first.
No, I was agreeing with Director Laird. Completely agree. I mean, isn't there something coming up on the board? Sorry, with a fire, it was a bush truck that was further in the agenda or further down the budget, and they saved some money and they're going to use it. Now, suppose we decided we needed a bush truck, or we knew we needed one 5 years from now, and there was some kind of grant that came along. There we've got that contingency fund or whatever you want to call it, and we can use it for that truck sooner than later. I think we need to be flexible and be able to take advantage of opportunities. So thank you, Director Laird.
CFO Fox,
Alls I would say is I think here, the way that we've structured gas tax or community works and discretionary allows the board to address some of those opportunities within their region. I think that's kind of the difference that we've had here, but I will move on if we're good.
please.
So I'm not gonna, I feel like I'm going backwards here. The risk categories we've talked about with the operating and capital risk mitigation. I'm going to jump over this here. Risk mitigation. So I think we've talked a lot about what your comfort level is with that. I'm comfortable with what I'm hearing. Funding sources, what funding sources should be used to build and maintain these reserves. So typically what's happening is in certain areas, grants will come along and we will put the grants aside. So gas tax, community works funds, those are in a reserve. They're not specific to a service, and then they're allocated as you choose. We have two other grants that come in that I mentioned earlier that are specifically in reserves that you can use for other projects. The user fees, taxation, we do that specifically when we have a transfer to the reserve on the operating budget, and that's how money is getting in. Before, it wasn't as thought out as I think we're putting forward now. So, and it's going to, this is where I commented that it'll be a difficult exercise after we set parameters, because then I have to see where we're at, how much we need to get to where we're going, and then what's that investment, and can we even actually achieve that? So there's some steps that are going to be a little bit challenging with 120 reserves. So replenishment strategies. So again, it's kind of inferred, like if we have a 5 or 10-year plan and it has to be funded, we know that the reserve is going into the negative in year 5. The replenishment strategy is we want a fully funded 10-year capital plan, and you're going to need to put in another $500,000 into the reserve to meet all that's on here. If you don't want to do that and increase taxation to get that much money in here, what are we going to change? What priorities are we going to change? And we've kind of talked about some ranking tools for projects that build in, you know, the social need and capital infrastructure need. And so start introducing that a little bit more to help us make informed decisions to shift projects out. What I'm very familiar with is not having enough money and having to make decisions to shift project out. And risk and safety and those sorts of things bump a project up further. So really the replenishment strategy, we are reviewing it annually. I am going over a 5-year capital plan. I'm putting forward a funded plan to you that you can see where projects are funded from. I'm coming to you and saying, I don't have enough money to fund this. If you want this to happen, that's what's going to happen. If you want this to happen, we need another 5%. If not, what else can we do? Under what circumstances should reserves be accessed or used? What approval process should be in place for the use of reserves? We really talked that one through. Having a policy that covers some of these things, and then if it's outside that policy, we're coming to the board to ask for approval. If it's not in the financial plan, I've already told you, we have to come to you for approval if it's not in there, even if it's emergent contingency and it's not identified in the 5-year financial plan bylaw, but it's sitting in a reserve, we can't access it unless you approve the spending so that you've got protection that way. Should there be flexibility? We had a whole conversation about flexibility and how flexible we want to be. Funds raised in a service must always stay within that service. So that's not flexible in that. It's flexible within those parameters. You can, as a board, decide to loan money from one reserve in one service to another service, but you actually have to pay interest back, and it has to be a term, and we follow that. It's a loan, an internal loan, essentially, and that has been done in a couple areas. It's not done often. It's administratively a burden, but we do it on occasion with direction of the board. The status and usage of reserves should be reported to the board and the public. How should they be reported? So right now, and with what detail and frequency? So I'm talking to you about what kind of reporting you want to see and what detail. I'm telling you right now, you get every reserve, what's going in and out. And I can give you that at any time. You're seeing that we report it to you in actuality, in comparison to the budget as well. When you're getting the budget variance, we can include that with the reserves if that's what you would like to see. Really what you're seeing is this is a capital plan. This is the funds that were associated with that capital. So if we're spending that capital, you're seeing the capital being spent. So I don't know if it's overly valuable to show you the matching, because we don't typically reconcile capital. We don't do a final year end on capital till the end of the year. So lots of times you're not going to see that revenue even coming in and out of the reserve until the end of the year. And we're trying to bring you financial budget variance quarterly. And the last year we brought you the report for the board, or for the budget to the board, at least 3 times in detail. So you're getting it quite a bit building up to approval of the budget. If for some reason you wanted to see that differently, we would have to discuss that. But right now I've already increased that frequency by bringing you budget quarterly reporting. Accountability measures included in to ensure proper management and use of reserves. Are there specific metrics or benchmarks you would like to see in place? What I would say as far as accountability, we are held accountable to our jobs by the CAO. We have certain parameters we have to operate within. We have to follow the legislation. We have to follow policy. We have to follow bylaws. We can't spend without approval within a financial plan. There's a lot of accountability that's already in there. If for some reason somebody made a decision that fell with outside of this, that maybe they should not have, the accountability is then I have to be held accountable by my employer for my job. And that isn't something that would be done in public. And that would be something that the board could have closed session conversation with the CAO on. But adherence to policies, that's across the board. That's just not special to this policy here. That's in general. That's your accountability. If you want accountability outside of that, I'm not really even sure what that would be. But it's good to have the conversation because I think sometimes people don't know how that would work, right? And I certainly, if I did something, I wouldn't want Director Thorpe to say, Carla, why didn't you follow that? And maybe something happened. Maybe there was mitigating circumstances. Maybe something was going on in my life. Goodness. And so it would be good for Director Thorpe to bring that up through the way of the chair and try and get an understanding and give that person dignity in their role. The review cycle, so we are reviewing this all through the fall. So we start reviewing this in September. We go through the capital plan, we go through the operating plan, and we build you a budget, and we're reviewing it constantly until March. We're not typically, once the new year comes and we're through year end, we're operating. We see anomalies. We're going to bring those up. You're going to see that in the budget variance report. So that's how you're seeing this information be reviewed. And I think this is right in relation to Director Thorpe. You know, we want to be adaptable, and there are things sometimes within policies you're aware that you want to make decisions outside that. We bring you a report and you make a decision outside that. Typically, our guide is if you're making decisions continuously outside the policy isn't working. I think the other thing to note is that if a policy is too stringent, you all of a sudden create other behaviors within practices that you maybe didn't intend to. Making something too restrictive or forcing people to spend all their budgets creates unhealthy spending. I have gone into organizations where it's like, you must spend every penny or you're going to lose it and they're going to take it away. That's not reasonable and it creates unhealthy things. Or in emergent situations, I've always had a situation where a fire department or somebody has come and they've said, this is an emergency. I don't have time to wait for board approval. This has to happen right now. What do you expect me to do? Walk through, water up to my waist? I got to fix this right now. It's flooding right now. So we want to make it possible for our staff to deal with emergent situations under your level of comfort. So comparative practices, I'm not going to go through this in detail. What I would prefer is if there is something that you've seen within one of the comparables that I've provided, email it to me. I would prefer that because then I can take your input and try and integrate it into what I'm doing, if that's okay. And there's only a few of you in the room. I don't think I'm going to be inundated here. So. Community impact. So, and I think we do this. This is what you guys are doing by trying to make more accountability around the use of reserves and surplus by defining this policy within your comfort level. And that's how we are impacting the community. We also impact the community in a very unique way within regional districts by way of the community works program right now. There's nowhere else that addresses individual community needs the way that fund addresses needs. And I think the ability for us to have that community impact is unique to the regional district. So I think that is something that we should be happy for. And it leads into the capital plan, making sure there's reserves or grants to be able to address those needs. We also do that by way of grant needs for some, we don't want you to take this over, but we want to run it. Can you give us some money to run this? And we do things like that. Reserve balance limit. So this is where I don't know unless you want to give me something specific. We have been talking about percentages. I'd like to bring to you what I think is reasonable for us to achieve. And then I've just kind of informed you of and provided you with other policies that you can see what they felt was reasonable or different as far as what limits. There's very specific to people who have more robust capital planning, and there's big to where they're trying to provide parameters, but it's not overly specific. Chair, I think Director Grenier has a question.
Mr. Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. Glad you raised that. Good place to start, because I'm looking at it, is that development services number of roughly 2.1 million. And you said, how much is enough? And I'm asking the question, how much is enough? If in the strata world, in the residential stratas, the target, the target is 1 year's worth of strata income in your contingency. And beyond that, that would be too much. So when I look at development services, trying to make the comparison, how much does it cost to run development services if we didn't have, if we went into a downturn and we went into a downturn for a year, what would that not be? If we could survive 2 years, is that enough? I think that that's a great place to look at it. Most of the time, I would think that we wouldn't be running into a top end level, but I think it's very useful in things like that, where we don't need to continue zombie-like collecting it. Let's do something with it, give it back. That's an opportunity.
Director Stamer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And just to add to Director Grenier's, because we're doing a 5-year plan every year, I think that we should be looking at those parameters as well. 2 years may not be enough time in that process because, as we alluded to back to the development services portion, there seemed like there was an awful lot of excess in there, but if memory serves me, there's a dramatic reduction in that reserve in the next 5 years, correct? So I think we have to be cognizant of that as well, is that 2 years may seem like a long time, but with that 5-year plan, there was a significant shift in those reserves. Isn't that correct?
Thank you. Yes, there was a shift. We had to shift back out of the development services usage of the reserve because it was actually specifically for building services. But I think from my perspective, that is the one area where I felt like the board would bring it back to the table this year. So that might be an area, if you want to have a specific conversation, let's say next time we go into and we talk about the draft policy I bring you, and if you're good with that, and maybe we need a little bit more of a specific look at the development, the building services reserve at that time, and to see over the 5 years, because it is important that we look at how much we were taking out of that, how much the operating costs are, what you would feel comfortable as a contingency, because if we can do some of that work in advance, I think that would save some time at the board table if we've kind of got a plan that you guys want to bring forward with that. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. And just as a supplementary to that, if I may, I'll give you another example of how things can change. I mean, the fire district budget in Barrier is split in half between the district of Barrier and Area O that is in the fire protection area. And we can plan ahead with our capital replacement costs that are somewhat dictated by the government on how long we can keep the number one truck, right? Like that's, and as you notice with some of the other volunteer fire departments, because of the lack of density and lack of size, they can hold on to their equipment a lot longer than we can, but at the same time, they don't use it as much. But we're looking at a possible 4-story building that could be built in Barrier. Well, if we do that, we need a ladder truck. That's not in the budget. So even though we're going to be, purchasing hopefully a used one, nowhere in that budget do we have a ladder truck. And we're also asking people out in Glen Grove and the outer edges of our municipal or our fire protection boundary to pay for something that will probably never, ever be used on their properties. So that's where we got to have that little bit of flexibility, just as a sidebar.
Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was a little disappointed this year that we never had our planning session with the board as to where we're going and what we're doing. Because with that, if we miss the planning session, that impacts our financial planning. Because the board looks to see what our financial or basic 5-year plan is. And the 5-year plan basically helps build the 5-year financial plan. There can be deviations from year to year of what's a priority, what isn't a priority, what is new that we want to do as a board that isn't even in our 5-year financial plan. If we do not have those planning sessions, and as I was told this year, well, we didn't have to because we already have a 5-year plan. We didn't look at it, we didn't renew it, we didn't refresh it. That is very key as a board. That's the political input and decision-making that goes into the whole planning of the regional district. Because every area and every municipality has inputs that change every year. They're not static. And we need to have those planning sessions. And if we don't have those, you don't have direction from for the finance to address any changes that come up. And I'm not sure exactly what the timing should be, but a planning session should be timely enough that if there's any changes in our direction of the board of where they want to go with their overall plan for the regional district, that can be addressed in the current financial year. And unfortunately, we didn't do that this year. And that's a big part of our job as an elected official to do the planning. Anyway, we are having a planning session next year, but I'd like to hear when that needs to be done to affect our financial plan.
Director Grenier.
I would totally echo that. And I think it should be mid-year, and it should be part of that planning session is looking at that 5-year capital plan that you've been able to put together and say, is there any additions or alterations to this? So that timely review helps keep us on track and helps identify shortfalls. So I think or changes.
Jamie.
Thanks. Just a response to that. I think I understand the comments. I just want to provide some clarification around the strategic planning process. And yes, that's the big picture plan. And that does set our direction for things we incorporate in the budget. Separate from that, though, is the capital planning process, which is through the annual budget cycle. So we're going to revisit the capital plan every year. And that's when we have the pre-meetings, even before it comes to the board, with specific area directors. So they kind of know the details of the capital plan that are affecting their areas. So I appreciate Director Laird's comments. And yes, I agree that if there's a change in strategic direction in terms of what we're doing, that does affect the budget. But strategic planning wouldn't affect when we're buying a new fire truck in year 3 versus year 5 or things like that. So, and I know that wasn't what you were suggesting, but I think we just need to be careful not to blur the lines between capital planning and overall board strategic planning, because that's, I think I heard some things that are kind of crossing the line there.
Noting the time, Director Grenier.
Well, just on that, we've got this library this third library that we're talking about. We have a Sun Peaks library that we're talking about. We've given direction to our library staff to continue pursuing those opportunities. There's some point I expect that they would come back to us and say, we've got a site, we've got a building, we've got a budget, we've got whatever. And I think that that's where the strategic plan and the capital plan have to be revisited. And I think you've made your comment and I've made my point.
Okay, I don't care who talks now.
Okay, so I'm going to move into surplus just quickly. And we've covered some of this also. So
just a point of order. Director Morris is leaving our meeting.
Got it? Okay. So I just want to show what we kind of looked at over this last year after we had the 10% allowable surplus calculation. So we went through every service, looked at the operating costs, said what was 10%. Then we came in on a surplus, and then we compared that budget variance, and we provided that within the documentation when all of that was presented to the board. What we've done, when I first started, there was, it was like between maybe around $7 million surplus. And then since then, over the last 2 years, we've slowly been bringing that down. We've moved money out that was dedicated for capital that kept coming forward every year as surplus into reserve funds. We cleaned that up quite a bit. And I feel like we're doing actually a pretty good job. There's areas where the budgets are larger, where there's swings, or there's sometimes percentages that seem really high that are small little budgets that, you know, there was an extra 2,000 spent in critical street lighting and it's 50% over. So I think my desire of where I want this to go for number one is to capture in the policy the best I can how you guys would like us to handle surplus. One would be there's an allowable 10% of operating surplus year over year. A presentation will be made to the board doing, so here's the trick. We don't really know the surplus until the next year. So when I'm doing budget deliberations, we're trying to guesstimate our surplus to the best of our ability. So I can give you a heads up. And I can say, hey, this is where it's looking like it's flushing out right now. And for me to put off decision-making around budget till after December is not what I would prefer. Things get really busy for me come January with year-end and audit. So for me to have to rethink surplus and the direction you want me to take surplus at that point becomes a little bit of a burden to me. It's not that I can't do it. I'm just telling you my preference is to have that decision made before when we're roughly able to give you that number. In December, when we come to you in December with the provisional budget, I should be able to bring you something that's, you know, fairly accurate. And you guys could make some good decisions around that if it was out of whack. So what I would propose is that the surplus, I don't know if I have it in here. We have, here's the 10% allowable, here's where the surplus came in, here's the variance. And what we would add to here is a reasoning for the variance. You would look through that. We would have a discussion. Is there anything there that's outside of the variance that you guys would like to discuss? And if it's building services or development services and they had like a $200,000 surplus and it's outside the 40,000 allowable, you can at that point say, okay, we want that all to go back to the taxpayers, or we want to use that for this project, or we want this money to go to the reserve. And to have a discussion then where you actually give us a direction as to what you want to see done with that surplus. We could have in some of the services where it says anything in excess of the 10% will be placed into the reserve. So 10% of the surplus will carry forward into the revenue and reduce taxation in the following year, following legislation. The other portion would be a transfer to the reserve and it would no longer be surplus because it is seen as an expenditure.
Director Stamer.
I just have a quick, thanks. I just have a quick question. I mean, I know the rules say that when you have a surplus, it's supposed to basically come right off the taxes next year. So I'm not even gonna get into that. Where is the correlation on that with the 5-year plan? So where do you get to see, for an example, whatever that line item was, and you have an extra $10,000 or whatever it was, back on the other one where it was the general, when it showed all the, it showed the, right there. Where do you get that opportunity where you would know instantaneously that in that cemetery account, there's going to be a significant hit in a 5-year plan? Would you be able to have a correlation with that? Or how would you be able to tell us, oh, by the way, yeah, we've got an extra $13,000, but in our 5-year capital plan, we still have to come up with another 50,000. Where does that information combine? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so it's not as fluid as you're seeing it.
You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? Is there a
Yeah.
way of, it's no different than the variance. Is there a way of identifying how that could extrapolate, especially if we're talking a fair amount of money where either we're on schedule or we're not? All of a sudden, you know, that surplus variance is not where it's supposed to be. We're going to be in a surplus, but it's not going to be in the targeted surplus or the targeted revenues. How do we know that?
So I'm gonna cover a gamut of things and hopefully I hit one of them that you're looking for. So if you were to go back and see the budget that I presented to you guys, if you were to look at even the budget variance report, if you look at a service, probably not in the budget variance because I'm not giving you it, I'm giving you the total by service. If you look in the detail by service and you looked at critical street lighting and here's the revenue and expenses. The revenue minus the expenses for 2023 has a surplus. You would see that exact number in transfer from surplus in the revenue in the next year. Beyond the next year, we do not budget surplus. You are not allowed to budget for a surplus. It's zero budget. So it only affects that 1 year. But if you are consistently coming in under budget by 10%, if you take that 10% out and not carry it forward as revenue, your taxes are going to go up because you haven't changed your operating budget. So I do it in conjunction with a whole lot of other things. We look at the capital budget, and then we look at the plan for the capital, and then how do we fund that capital? Oh, I'm short here and here and here. Okay, if I need that to carry forward, now I go to the operating budget. Can I put $50,000 more in Community Park B and still be able to maintain that budget? Do I have enough room? How much is that going to impact? Then typically what would happen is we would go to the Area B director and say, there's this challenge. Are you comfortable with this? Do you think you would want this increase here? And we look at that. Oh, you know, we anticipate it's a bit more disjointed than looking at the surplus because lots of times when we're doing that planning, don't have a great idea of the surplus, but usually it's coming in fairly consistent. So we can rely on that as long as there's no swing. So we do look at the previous year. We do look at the current budget. We do look at the capital plan and what we need from there. And we've only had 1 year experience with this. So it's training my staff as well to understand when we're capital planning and the funding and showing them, oh, look, all of a sudden you planned to buy this, you don't have any money. So how do we do that? Oh, now you need more money over here. So I'm kind of working them through that as well. The more we're educated, we're doing that more proactively than reactively, but we're still doing it prior to that coming to you guys. It's not as easy to say, but I think if we kind of work that into our way of thinking as we're doing that and we're saying we need this $50,000, hey, board, we have an extra surplus anticipated here. Can we use that 50,000 here and make that more of a separate decision?
If I may, as a supplement, I think what you've explained is that we're not seeing those movements behind the scenes. I'm not suggesting we want to. You've explained that with the understanding of the budgets and with the communication with the directors involved, those mechanisms are already working behind the scenes. And then as long as they work within the parameters of what we've established, then what we see is basically the end result. So you've already explained that a lot of the directors wouldn't understand that that's exactly what's going on behind the scenes in those areas. So you've explained it, I think, quite well in as much as that staff is identifying if there's any shortfalls or anything like that, any discrepancies. There's a discussion involved in what we actually do going forward. And then when we get to the point where there's a surplus or, you know, there's a reserve discussion, you've already done the preliminary work. You already know exactly pretty much what the answer is. And then the mechanism is for the board to either agree or disagree.
Yeah, so typically wherever we land with those service budgets, if there's anomalies that swing the increase up or down a lot, the board member wants to know. So when we're meeting to go over those services, we're talking about that, or individual challenges, we'll have separate conversations about that. So what my hope is here is that being aware of this kind of new process as we're doing the planning and as we're looking and paying attention a little bit more to our surplus during that November, December timeline, when we come in December, we'd have a list saying, this is our anticipated surplus, this is where it's out. Are there ones in here that have a variance that you guys would like to have a separate conversation and separate direction on? That gives you that ability without me having to explain our variance in every single service, which then becomes not very realistic.
Director
So.
Grenier?
Quickly, you had said last year, you felt comfortable starting off at 10%. If you, using your example, if you had 3 years of that, you might come back to us and say, hey, I don't think we need 10%. We need 8% or 7%. So yeah, that regulating thing where it goes back into income and then you're looking at it, that would give you the flexibility and it would give us the comfort.
And I think to just add to that, trying to do something that we think will help meet most situations. We obviously have 124 unique services, and sometimes 10%, we may end up saying 10% for solid waste, where it's like our largest budget. Maybe that is not reasonable, but having that historical data to go back to over 3 years would be really helpful to make more informed decisions. I don't think I need to go back with you guys. I think you guys understand where surplus comes from. I think of it as reserves are intentional. Surpluses happen, and then we get to decide. It's like a feeling. I have a feeling, and now I get to choose how I'm going to react to that. So we have surpluses that happen based on our operations. Now we get to decide. By default, it's already being decided. For the most part, it's just going up and offsetting revenue. The problem for me is really when it's a problem right now is when the surplus isn't consistently the same. So if I'm consistently bringing in 20% of a surplus and then the next year it's 10%, my taxes are going to go up. So it just becomes much more complicated. But for the most part, what I'm trying to do is provide a blanket solution that works for most, and then be able to reasonably have time to address the unique situations. And hopefully that meets your needs. That's what I would bring forward. And I really wanted to ensure that you guys understood the difference between the surplus and the reserve. I think you have a good sense of what we're doing. I'm pretty authentic that we're just kind of doing it as we feel we've done in the past, and it doesn't really have great parameters that the board's endorsed at this point. The policy to utilize excess surplus amounts over the 10% threshold for investment into reserves for future operational capital projects. I think that's reasonable as well. And maybe it's in certain areas. Maybe you say if it's 20%, but anything over 20% then has to come to us. I'll put it in there. You guys can give it some thought. Where this is going to be interesting is wherever we land. And then I move forward from that, actually trying to implement that and come up with what that's going to cost us. Then that's going to put proof to whether we can actually call. And then we might have to adjust and make decisions from there. We can't actually put in, 25% into a reserve to meet this capital need. We're going to have to rely on grants, or we're going to have to take a loan. So we have approximately $50 million in general operating costs. 10% of that is 5 million. In 2023, the surplus amounts overall were 4.6 million. So the excess would be 400,000. But you can't really say we would put $400,000 in a reserve, because that's a accumulation of 124 different reserves. We have to do it by reserve and by service. So one might be up within the threshold, one might be down. One might be, the percentages sway based on the size of the operating budget. But I wanted to give you an idea of, I'm happy just in the fact within the last 2 years, we've brought the overall surplus down a significant amount. And that's from intentional things that we've been doing. Last year, we cut operating budgets more than I've ever seen, to the point where I was a little bit worried. So we'll see. The proof will be in the pudding this year. Just wanted to throw those numbers out there for you. We've already seen that. This was just the detail of all the reserves to tell you that it is in your budget package. You could go back to this. Okay, that is really helped us walk through that. I feel actually really good about the conversation that we had today and where you guys are at. I think it's where I thought you probably were. But I feel like it was really a well-rounded conversation. I hope you guys feel the same. So thank you very much. And I got some good feedback on the budget variance as well that I'll work with for next time.
I need some clarification here. Do you want that resolution to take it to the governance committee moved, or are you going to be reconsidering things?
That's for the budget variance.
Rated surplus and reserve, there's a recommendation to send it to the governance committee for review. But it sounds to me like you want to do a bit more work.
Sorry, yeah, I was to remove that and I missed that at the last because I had put in a draft policy and then I'm like, no, we're not at that stage. So I removed that. Sorry, my
Not a
error
problem
there.
at all. Any new business? Director Laird. Okay, Director Laird, go ahead.
When the policy that you're putting in place, what sort of timelines do you think you have in it? Are you going to need this policy in place to look at your 2025 budget?
So my hope would be that I could have a draft policy to you guys by the next meeting that you guys could kind of feel comfortable with. We could bump that up to the policy and governance. I would use whatever we kind of land on there as guidance as I'm building the budget, because it'll take it's a bit of a process to go through the policy and governance, then to the board, to have that adopted. I want to make it a policy that would be reasonable to use for this go. But there may be instances that I can't actually meet. I'm going to try and find a balance that it'll be a good guide for me this year. And then as we get down the path of asset management and the more that we know, maybe the more stringent it becomes with more knowledge, or we might have some go arounds to the policy until we can actually financially meet it and we could be aware of that. So I do want it to bring it to you by September and have that guide my practices. And then hopefully over the fall, we'll get that first rendition approved.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of policies, but as you say, if you make them too stringent, it doesn't work. You have to be policy is just where you want to go and how you're supposed to. It gives you the opportunity for decision making within the policy. You don't want it that strict and restricted.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're good to go?
September meeting?
Yep. September meeting. Any new business from anyone? Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Director Stamer.